Hello, I'm Paul Louis Metzger, the director of the Institute for Cultural Engagement, New Wine, New Wineskins, and welcome to another episode of New Wine Tastings, where we seek to build relational bridges through Jesus in contemporary culture. We are now going through a series on medical ethics, specifically a personalist approach to medical ethics, and this is our first episode, or rather our fifth episode in this series with Dr. Robert Potter, a medical doctor by trade and a medical ethicist with expertise in internal medicine and palliative care. And again, as I said, an expert in medical ethics as well from a personalist vantage point. Dr. Potter, thank you once again for joining me for this episode at New Wine Tastings. And today our emphasis is a personalist approach to medical ethics, individual patients, not statistics. Individual patients are not statistics. So you have said before, Robert, that learning statistics is learning probabilities, not actualities, in each instance of patient care. You have also said that all too often medical professionals translate probabilities into individuals. That's not possible, you've argued. Probabilities only apply to a group of individuals, not an individual patient. Why does the medical community so often impose probabilities on individual patients in your estimation?
Well, I'm going to claim that we use statistics because they're helpful. Okay, now in order to get to that claim that they're helpful, I'd like to lay out a little bit about how I understand statistics. I'm not a numbers man. I can hardly add and subtract, okay? But I think I understand statistics from the composition of what it's out to do. You even look at the word statistics. The basic piece of that is the word status. That is the state of reality, the state of persons within a set of persons. And when you take 100 persons that have similar conditions and put them in a set, we will describe their condition as statistically. That is a little bit here and a little bit there. All persons are made so individualistically, even though we are created by our social relationships, those social relationships are so complex and so constantly changing that every person that's created by their social relationships is unique in itself. So every person is unique in itself. But okay, let's put 100 people together, 100 persons together who have similar, but now remember, similar but not identical conditions. And let's see what happens to those 100 persons. Well, the first thing we say, oh, some things happen that are kind of similar. So let's bunch those up over here in this bunch. And lo and behold, let's say that's 10 of the 100 all fit in this bunch. So they fall into the possibilities by 10%. 10% of people are going to be in this possibility range, but we don't know which ones. See, that's the key. We know that there's going to be a bunch of folks that fit in here as they follow the statistical table, we call it, but we don't know which ones. And there is the problem. Because physicians would like to use the statistical table to warn them about what can happen to certain sets of people. Let's look at the condition, an infectious condition called hepatitis. Now, hepatitis can be bunched up into little sets depending on how many people get sick when they're exposed. And we know that of all the people who get exposed, not all of them get sick. Okay, so there's going to be a percent that don't get sick. How the infection itself goes, how sick they are when they get sick, how do they respond to treatment, what kind of complications develop, what kind of long-term effects are going to be there, particularly in hepatitis, because it is a long-term disease. And we don't know at all how that pattern is going to work out. But we know there is a pattern. And the patterns we look for is, okay, 60% of these folks are going to have this kind of a problem. Therefore, I as physician ought to be on alert to deal with that problem that's going to happen in 60 of 100 of them, so that I can be alert to it, deal with it in any effective way that I possibly can. The problem is that these patterns become the prognosis. You see, the patterns become the prognosis. And rather than simply the clues as to what we have to work with next or anticipate working with as the reality of this person's illness or injury, can be the same thing, because injury's got all of its variables too, you know, the injury, what part is injury, how much force was involved with the injury, what part of the body is damaged by the injury, you know, on and on and on. There are multiple factors that go into the nature of an injury, just as it is the nature of an infection. And our statistical tables tries to bunch together those things that are really similar to give us some clue as to what we ought to anticipate. And it is good and it is important. But when the possibilities and the patterns become the prognosis to tell what's going to happen to an individual, that's sliding down the slippery slope and misusing the statistical table.
Thank you, Robert.
And we're all of us docs are prone to that, you know, because it is so useful, and it's really important that we know the statistical table. We just have to be careful that we don't apply the table as if we know what's going to happen to any one person.
Well, and you know, before we go further into that point about that it moves physicians or doctors toward prognoses. I mean, statistics matter, they are helpful. They help prepare a doctor for how to attend to various issues, and there's a lot on their plates, right? There's a lot on your plate that you have to deal with, but it's moving toward prognosis that prematurely, shall we say. And before we get there, I wanted to ask you, what is it that causes you to seek to guard against the slippery slope? You said you're not an expert in statistics. Is it a certain view of statistics, or is it your account of a personalist philosophy? How does that come into play? Because you've already said each person, this is last week, each person who's a patient is the exception to the rule. It's not this individual patient per se, it's a group of individuals. So it seems like personalism comes into play, but could you unpack it further? What is it that causes you to hit that pause button against the slippery slope?
Well, what causes me to use it to begin with is that the patient or the patient's family or some loved one will ask me, Potter, what's going to happen here? What's going to happen to me? What's going to happen to my loved one? And I'd like to answer that. You know, it doesn't do a whole lot of good. Say, well, you got a 10% possibility of this and a 20% possibility of that and a 60%. You know, that's not a very effective answer to a person. You do have to answer, say, well, there's a spectrum of possibilities and a spectrum of probabilities that any one possibility will be the outcome. But I always have to say, you know, I don't know which of these possibilities will be your possibility. We just simply have to wait for it all to work itself out. So we docs would like to know, you know, we sort of present ourselves as knowing. What we have to understand is that when it comes to prognosis, we know nothing more than the statistical table. And that's a little hard to admit. But
why is that?
You know,
why
we're
is it hard to
respond to the patient's need. The patient wants to know what is going to happen to me, and I can't tell you. Now here's some probabilities, but that doesn't mean that I know which one of the probabilities will be your possibility?
Well, in my experience, even with our son situation, as I've alluded to earlier in a previous episode or two, my son, as you know, Robert, very well, is a consultant to us at this time. He's had a devastating brain injury, traumatic brain injury, and he's in a comatose state for over 3 months. There have been times when doctors have said, we don't know. The brain is so mysterious, we do not know. It was a surgeon, neurosurgeon.
Yeah.
That didn't trouble me. That actually comforted me.
Yeah.
Not because the doctor said it's smooth sailing here on out. He had said the situation is grim, but we don't know. And the possibilities, as you yourself have said, there are real possibilities for moderate to dramatic healing. We just don't know at this time, and time is needed. So I understand the point. They want to help. You want to help patients, and just giving percentages isn't always sufficient. But I have found it comforting at times when doctors say, I don't know. You want them to know what to do in terms of which medicine to prescribe.
Yeah.
That's one thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and remember, I was saying that the statistical table helps us to stay alert to possibilities, anticipate possibilities, to interpret fresh clues as a new possibility emerging here.
Yes.
Yeah, we have to keep constantly doing that, but we can't do it before it happens. We can't act before the possibility emerges as part of the reality before us. That's always so. Actually, we docs are just slightly behind the curve all the time. No matter how hard we try, we can't anticipate what to do next unless the clues to what to do next emerge.
Right.
In
And
Son's
so,
case, for instance, the business of the fevers that were so troubling early on. The fever was a clue. Clue to what? Well, we know that brain injury can cause fever because of the injury itself, or it can be because of infection in the brain, or it can be because of infection in the lung, or infection in the bladder, infection someplace else in the body. We've got the clue. Now we've got to really rush in there and do all the work that we need to do to establish what's this new reality that we're dealing with, the new possibility made real by this clue. And so, but as I say, we're just one step behind the curve.
and
We'll
just to
watch
that,
for another clue, and by the time that other clue pops up, like a chest X-ray showing the pneumonia, we're already behind the curve to get the chest X-ray, and the pneumonia shows up, for instance. We're already behind. So we're trying hard to stay up, but we're constantly behind the curve in everything as it develops.
yeah. Well, and while that's certainly true, and to be fair, as you're seeking to be to statistics and statistical analysis, it's because of good statistical analysis that doctors, when they're one step behind because they're responding to a situation that arises, they can't help but respond. They don't have a crystal ball.
Right.
You and they are thinking through, okay, based on these probabilities, this medicine may very well help in this situation, or this medicine can lead to this kind of reaction. And I have seen great problem-solving skills in my son's situation based in part on the statistical analyses. It's just as you said, when they move toward definitive prognoses is where it becomes deeply problematic.
Exactly. I think that is an important key to take away from this conversation. That statistics are helpful and useful, but cannot be over-interpreted.
Thank you. And so this idea of being premature to come up with prognoses, that's a great danger, as you had said, because then people prescribe or make ultimate judgments of what's going to happen. And as you and I have discussed before with my son's situation, whenever that has happened, way in advance, I go, well, that's going to affect how they're going to treat him. And then I say, can we please hit the pause button here? That was an inappropriate jump. And on the whole, I have been encouraged by how there'll be an owning up of the complexity of things. And it's generally not the ultimate authority if in a particular situation will make that judgment. It'll be someone else who will make a statement. I go, well, I hope that's not what they're acting upon, because that's premature. So prognoses and then prescriptions and the like, what are some of the other dangers associated with premature judgments based on groups of individuals, statistics on groups of individuals rather than this individual? Can you add one or two more concerns that would arise in this regard as to the dangers of doing so?
Yeah, well, I guess as I draw upon my own experience and experience of teaching others about these matters, I think where statistics has to be carefully examined is right there that where we're focusing. Number one, statistics can help us. Here's the problem with statistics always. Statistics is putting together into a set. We call it a set, a statistical table or a set. A group of people that are similar but not identical. Now, being similar, then we try further to identify what's similar in the reality in which they are existing in. Even sorting folks out into similar sets, like the 20% is who's going to be sick this way, or the 20% is going to be sick in this way, is by itself a decision that is not based on a real tight definition of the set. The set will have similar qualities. All people within that set will have similar qualities, but not identical. So you got to go back to the reasoning that persons can be similar, but not identical. And because you have to start with that similar but not identical, it only gives you an approximation. Even the tightest statistical set can only give you an approximation of what is possible with any one person. So even though you want to approach the statistical table as something that has been worked up with care and precision, it is actually not a precise instrument. Mm-hmm. It is already a fuzzy instrument. Mm-hmm. And so then when you begin to apply it to any one person, the fuzziness gets fuzzier. And so what starts out as a number, you see, cannot continue to exist as a solid number. It's always a sliding scale of somewhere around that number, mm-hmm. but not actually the number. So even though we ought to give some real credence, a real thought to, real dependence upon, really use the statistical table, we must see it as an incomplete and flawed instrument. Mm-hmm. That's the way you have to start out. And when physicians do not start with that point of view of statistics, if they start out with a more rigid view of statistics, they will go wrong. They will make decisions that are based on that which is not accurate. Hmm. And so, I fall way back onto the position that it's not only accurate, but misguiding to assume that because 60% of people, or even 80% of people, or even 90% of people ought to behave this way, according to our statistical table, you cannot say that any one person will be among that 90. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's it. That's the next thing I have to drill in to the thought pattern of medical students. Yes, the table is valuable, but the table doesn't tell you what you want to know. You got that?
Mhm.
You hear me, student? The table is valuable. It can give you some ways to anticipate some possibilities, but it will not tell you what you want to know. And you want to know, is this person going to be one of those possibilities or not? It will not do that. So here you're asking people, asking students to buy an idea that doesn't work the way they'd like for it to work.
Mhm.
So it's a complicated educational strategy, Paul, a complicated educational strategy to both trust something and not trust something. You get the difference?
I do.
You know,
I
I
do.
know you do. You know, and then the subtleties of your own thought always expanded by your current experience. You know, is what makes you know what I'm talking about here. That you both can look at the statistics as being something that gives you some ideas, something to anticipate, but you cannot apply it to any one person.
Well, Robert, I know you're going to share in a few minutes something as a slide for us to review. I come back to your personalist philosophy, which I also share.
Yeah.
And when you add to the discussion of, probabilities and statistical possibilities, probabilities and the like, percentages, as important as that is, though it can be fuzzy, the more we drill down, we also have to account for the fact we're dealing with persons. We're dealing with people who are themselves mysterious. So we take the brain, which is itself a mystery, that even great surgeons say we know so little about it. As much as we know, there's so little we know. Add to that each person is mysterious.
Mm-hmm.
And from a personalist philosophy standpoint, each person has incommunicable worth, that they're so unique. We have to give time. We have to give time to see how each person may respond. It just shows the complexity. I love David Brooks. You may read David Brooks as well, I don't know, but the
Yeah.
New York Times columnist, where he talks about the movie Interstellar and says it's a cultural event because in place of the Newtonian framework of cogs in a machine, what we find in Interstellar is particle and wave in a vast ecosystem like quantum theory. And I just think we have to account for that kind of complexity. So
Right.
did you want to share at this point your slide?
No, not quite. I want to
Okay.
speak to it first, and then I want to show the slide and go over it a second time because embedded in that are the items that I think that we need to be clear about.
Good.
Now, when you talk about time, I talk about it in this way. I say we should take the moral pause.
Hmm.
I call it the moral pause. The moral pause is designed to let the possibilities work themselves out because the demand of a morality, the ethical demand in healthcare is to make decisions. Okay? That's what the ethical demand is, to make decisions. Some decisions ought not to be made until the right time to make them has arrived.
Hmm.
So you must have the capacity of moral pause when you recognize now is not the time to decide.
Hmm.
Now is not the time to decide. You may be being asked to decide. It's not the time to decide. So we'll go on a moral pause. A pause could be minutes or hours or days or weeks or months before the right time has arrived in order to make decisions. And here's the problem. The right time, as 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 interpreted by the professionals, may arrive because the before the right time arrives for you, the patient, or you, the loved one, making the decision. Deciding on the right time is a subtle determination. And I believe what I worked so hard for in ethical consultations and in ethical training was to teach the professional not to impose their time schedule onto the time schedule of the patient and their loved ones, the people making the decisions, particularly when it had decisions to do with life and death. So often, in dealing with my own patients, let's say, somebody in an ICU, critically ill, problem after problem, and I would cautiously approach, often in those cases, the loved one, because the patient themselves may be beyond capacity to communicate with me. And I would approach them with something like, do you think it's time to make a decision here? Does it look to you like it's time to make a decision? Well, then they'll turn it back on me. Well, doctor, what would you do? And I'd say, well, you know, I'm not sure it matters what I would do in this situation. It really matters what you would do in this situation. Now, what I need to do for you is define the situation as clearly as I possibly can. But I'm going to be cautious, if not even carefully avoiding telling you that I think it's time. Now, I have had moments when I have said to myself, and then eventually to the family or to the patient, I think it's time to decide here. Because they have been reluctant to what? Face the reality. The time is right, in my judgment, when the possibilities have come down to clear reality. This is what it's going to be. Now that's tricky, because once again, I have all said, on the one hand, we haven't exhausted all the possibilities until all the possibilities are exhausted. And we don't know whether you fit in one possibility or another possibility until all is exhausted. Well, that's almost true. If I've got someone who's desperately ill, they've been in congestive heart failure, I've got them on the ventilator, I can just barely keep their oxygen going. And now, guess what? Their kidneys are failing, and I'm going to have to put them on a kidney dialysis machine in order to keep their kidney function going. What I know, when multiple organ failure on top of multiple organ failure occurs, the possibilities are almost exhausted. And I think it's at least time to ask the question to the patient or to the patient's family, are the possibilities exhausted in your mind? That is, have you come to the place where you believe that you know enough to make a decision? To me, that's the key issue. Do you know enough? Me as doc, I think I knew enough 6 weeks ago, okay, or 2 days ago, or whatever. But that's my timeline, not theirs. It has to fit with, do they believe that they know enough to make the decision? When a family comes to the point that they believe that they know enough, whether or not all the possibilities have been exhausted, when they become to the point we believe we know enough to make a decision, that's when you make decisions. Occasionally, I have felt like even the patient's family has arrived prematurely. I would say, well, no, let's appoint there's a couple of more possibilities here. I've seen this turn around before, that kind of thing, you know. And they say, no, doc, we've had enough. She's had enough. Grandma's had enough. We believe we know enough to make decisions. And so you work with that. But the key is, as I'm saying, is you wait until the ones who have the moral authority to make the decisions have come to the point that they can say to themselves, we believe that we know enough to decide. Does that make sense, Paul?
It makes perfect sense. And again, it shows, as we've been talking about, a personalist orientation, because it's not just you as the doctor looking at statistical probabilities and possibilities. You're also accounting for the patient and also the patient's family.
Right.
And all of that adds complexity. It adds layers of complexity, not to punt indefinitely decisions, but in order to get at the best possible decisions one can hopefully find, where there's good closure, shall we say, in good time, so to speak. So
Well,
a fitting response.
Would you put up that screen sharing now?
Yep.
And let me go through it again, because I think this is the nugget of what I want to communicate. First of all, always take the moral pause. You gotta wait. You gotta give time for the possibilities to work themselves out. The length of the pause depends on the degree of what I'm going to call ambiguity. Ambiguity is just a fancy old Greek word which means what you don't know yet. Professional caregivers like me share probabilities with individuals, but professionals do not know eventual reality because they cannot know enough. You understand? What professionals believe is enough to know to make a decision may not be the same as what you, as the patient or the family, believe you ought to know. You must believe that you know enough to make a decision. Drop down to a line. When you believe, now this is key, when you believe that you know enough to decide, then you decide. And choose the possibility, the reality, but you have to wait for that belief that you know enough. When you believe that you know enough to determine the reality for yourself or your loved one, then you make decisions. And we're talking primarily in decisions that determine whether one lives or dies. But that's good. It fits for all kinds of ethical decisions. Wait for that belief that you know enough. And if you don't know enough, ask more questions, look at the situation more, build it up, figure it out, work it out. Belief is that capacity to either eliminate the ambiguity or to decide with some ambiguity left over, some uncertainty left over. Often faith can be defined even as deciding in the midst of uncertainty. But you want to be careful. You know, when uncertainty is so prominent in a decision making, it can become such a burden once the decision has been made and you reflect back on it and you say, I didn't pause long enough. That's why I'm making this point so vigorously, Paul. People, when they make decisions, need to keep the pause in place until they reduce the ambiguity to what they can believe that they now know enough. You got me?
I do.
That is the key, in my judgment, that is the key in making particularly those life-determining, death-determining decisions in healthcare.
And I think
And
it's
that, for me,
important.
finally then respects the dignity of the person.
Excellent, excellent. And just a few points on this slide, and then we're going to move toward transitioning to a close, we're ultimately talking about end of life care decisions at this time, because your area of expertise included palliative care and the like, and not that that's all you consulted over, but that's a key aspect of your work. And so when we're dealing with the moral pause, that could relate to all kinds of decisions, not just end of life care, but as you say here, you're seeking to limit or reduce the degree of ambiguity. And I would think it becomes all the more important the more pressing it is upon a person in terms of, like, is this a life-threatening or a life-ending situation? The stakes are higher in a situation like that. So all the more reason to be cautious until that degree of ambiguity is reduced sufficiently or removed, especially with end-of-life care type decisions, is what I understand you to say.
Right. Yeah, you have to.
What's that?
You have to remember that in most ethical decisions, before life-determining decisions, if it goes wrong and you've made a mistake, you can reverse much of it. When you've made life and death decisions, you can reverse, but once you go down the path, it is harder to reverse the decision and get some other result. I mean,
Right.
once you stop doing things that preserve life, life is going to end.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think just on this point, it's important for patients and their families to know that if they feel that they're being pushed toward a determination, they have to realize that they have the moral authority, even the way the medical system is set up. And you were part of that in the early days with palliative care in helping to reinforce that, so to speak, that the patient or those making the decisions on the part of a patient, it has the, shall I say, moral high ground, and the doctors must account for that. And so they can say, Doc, we need more time. I think that's important for those watching to realize that. Would you say that's accurate, Robert?
Not only accurate, but I feel like I was stupid not to say it before you said it. That's so insightful. That's exactly right. The patient and the patient's family have the moral authority, period. And they need to exert that moral authority. And they've got the moral authority. They've got the moral authority to determine whether or not they have come to the point where they believe that they know enough.
And one of the things we've had to deal with in our situation, and we're hoping for, we've seen some improvement, as you know, with Christopher's situation. We're hoping and praying for moderate to dramatic improvement. It will be miraculous for dramatic improvement, but however you see the miraculous, that does happen.
That's
And
right.
but that is what we're hoping and praying for, moderate to dramatic recovery.
Mhm.
I will say this, though, that I've had to, with your help, make clear to doctors we have a game plan. We have a plan in place, because they rightfully want to understand that patients' families are really dealing with the issues.
Yeah.
And I just encourage people, try and communicate well with doctors to say, we're working toward a plan. We have a plan. And at the right time, assert that plan. It helps the medical community so that they can get behind you, if they're doing it right, to support you in that plan.
Right.
And you've helped us immeasurably in that, Robert. So thank you so much.
Very
As
good.
we close, I know we have just a minute or two. I just want to draw attention to Jesus, whom you and I both value greatly.
Yeah.
When you look at Jesus and you look at how he engages people, he doesn't engage people as self-fulfilling statistical certainties. There's always the impossible possibility that Karl Barth would talk about. You see it in Jean Valjean and the bishop in Les Miserables, where the bishop does not treat him as a statistic, as a criminal who's going to be going right back to prison. He frees him with grace and forgiveness and mercy. And I think whether it's in medicine or it's in pastoral ministry, like, we should never look at people as self-fulfilling prophecies, but always keep the door open, what might occur. Dr. Potter, thank you so much for your time once again, as we have discussed today statistics, personalism, and medical ethics. Thank you for joining Dr. Potter and me, Paul Louis Metzger, for this episode of New Wine Tastings. Blessings to all of you in your own decisions related to medical ethics. Blessings to you all. Good night.